All right, everybody, we are going to get started. My name is Mark Echeveste. I am past president, or one of the past presidents of the Notre Dame Club of Phoenix, and I am the chair of the Continuing Education Committee. And I want to welcome each of you to our Hesburgh lecture. The Hesburgh lecture was inspired by the late Father Hesburgh, former president of the University of Notre Dame, and inspired by his legacy of lifelong learning. The Hesburgh Lecture Series has brought together university faculty to Notre Dame clubs and their local communities since 1986. The lectures, presented by mostly tenured faculty, showcase the depth and breadth of Notre Dame's academic expertise in research and teaching. The series furthers the mission of the Alumni Association to provide meaningful continuing education opportunities to Notre Dame alumni and friends. The Hesburgh Lecture Series brings the Notre Dame campus to its alumni, friends, and community through the Notre Dame clubs across the country by promoting intellectual dialogue with distinguished Notre Dame faculty. And in just a moment, we're going to have Dave White, who is the director of the Decision Center for Desert City here at ASU with the ASU Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability. Dave?
Thank you. And so I was just asked to come here and give a welcome on behalf of ASU. And so on behalf of the Wrigley Institute at ASU and the university, welcome here to the Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law, and welcome to ASU's downtown Phoenix campus. And I have the privilege of introducing Bruce Huber. So Professor Bruce Huber taught for several years in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College before joining Notre Dame in the law faculty in 2011. And he currently teaches and conducts research in the areas of environmental, natural resource, property, and energy law. And his particular areas of expertise include energy regulation, public land and resource management, and the interaction between law and politics. And like myself, Bruce is a lover of the American West, has studied and written about major river basins around the West, including the Columbia River Basin and the Colorado River Basin. And it's such an important topic. The Colorado River Basin in particular is just vital to the American West, to our environment, our economy, to our culture and our society in so many ways. And I'm very interested to hear and excited to hear Bruce talk about his work and his perspective, and I've encouraged him to be heretical here and say all the things that the local Arizona folks, professors can't say. And so, break the taboos and tell us how to fix water sustainability in the American West, and we welcome you and look forward to your talk, Bruce. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. How to fix the Colorado River, just a small task, ought to be easy for me to accomplish. Well, it's a real treat to be here with you all tonight. I appreciate the invitation of the Alumni Club, an honor to be with you, and an honor especially to be here at ASU's School of Law and at a program with the involvement of the School of Sustainability. A school which has meant a great deal to me professionally, has hosted some really influential events over the previous years that I've been honored to be a part of. So it's great to be back. And as Dave said a moment ago, I just want to make clear, you might look at that Notre Dame thing and what's a Notre Dame guy out here doing, talking about Western issues. I grew up in Seattle and spent about 20 years in the Bay Area of California, and have fell in love with the West, with vistas like this one. I mean, who could not come to a place like that and find their soul nourished and enriched by spending time in a place like this? Now, the water in the West is the title I've chosen. That's an enormous topic. I couldn't possibly do it justice in 30 or 40 minutes. It would be like trying to, explain World War II in half an hour or something. So rather than try to sort of lay out a particular thesis or make an argument, my hope today is to present you with a bit more of a smorgasbord. For those of you who are somewhat aware of water issues in the West, perhaps I'll be able to sort of give you something new, tell you a few stories that you haven't heard before. For those of you that are new, well, then I'm just going to help you get your feet wet. You see what I did there? So let's talk a little bit about water and the West. And I'll leave plenty of time, I hope, for some Q&A at the end. So if you have questions or comments or for things you'd like to speak about further, say those thoughts or interrupt me. I'm perfectly okay with being interrupted midstream. Okay. So now, so why do we care about water so much? Water, of course, touches on so many issues that are vital to human existence. We need it for irrigation, to produce crops, for municipal water supply, to drink and take showers. We often forget that rivers are crucial for navigation efforts. We need rivers to get from point A to point B. Water serves as crucial habitat for all kinds of species. Its scenic beauty is often the first thing that we think of or that we encounter or that becomes the most meaningful to us with respect to waterways. Recreation, right? What's better on a hot day, on a sort of a June Arizona afternoon than jumping into a cold stream? Energy. Often people forget the energy-water nexus, right? There's little about our energy infrastructure that does not depend crucially on water. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind in this connection would be hydropower, would be the many dams that occupy the Western landscape. But of course, we use water in all kinds of other connections. We often forget that all kinds of energy facilities rely on water for cooling. Any kind of combustion or nuclear power plant relies on enormous quantities of water. In fact, it's ironic that the only nuclear power plant in the world that is not located on a major body of water is your power plant right here, the Palo Verde plant, which relies on reclaimed wastewater instead for cooling purposes. Other than that, water and energy are crucially linked. And let's not forget, last of all, that sometimes we can get too much of it, as we're seeing right now in the Arkansas River, as we saw a few years ago so vividly up in Boulder and so forth. Flooding is a real problem, and that's another reason that we have a great deal of concern and pay so much attention to water out here in the West. Now, if you have even just glanced at headlines about water issues in the West, you know that sometimes these issues have a feel of intractability. And the only, there are numerous explanations for the intractability of water, but right now your principal question, I assume, is why on earth is there a picture of an iPhone right there on the screen as in response to the question of why are water issues so intractable? So I often relay this to my students. I find it amazing, right, that we as sort of the collective human brain, right, can come up with this. In fact, we can pick a date 6 months out and say we will have 18 million of these at Apple stores across the country with the latest, greatest technology, just absolutely unfathomable technological capacity in this thing, right? We can do that. And yet we can't keep water in a stream, right? We can't keep a stream clear because these are political problems at bottom, right? They're social problems, and it's often said in the United States, right, that we're a 21st century nation working with a 17th century government. I don't think it's even a 17th century government. It's way back before that, right? There's something primal about having to get people together to forge solutions about problems that are as complicated as the ones that water present to us. So we could list innumerable reasons why water issues are so intractable, but high on that list would be some of these. So for one thing, water issues span jurisdictional lines, right? We tend to make jurisdictions like this with straight lines, right? But that's not how water is. Water flows on rivers and aquifers that know nothing of our human jurisdictional boundaries. Those jurisdictions each have different structures, different rule makers, decision makers, and so forth. And waterways tend to span those jurisdictions in inconvenient ways. Water raises all kinds of issues, as we've already seen. Each of those issues often brings with it its own legal regime. There are numerous stakeholders, often who see issues at diametrically opposed perspectives. There are no clear criteria for success, as opposed to the iPhone, right, where we have a very clear criteria for success. We want to sell lots of them. We want it to work well. In water issues, there's often no clear criteria for success. We're also dealing in a domain where there's profound uncertainty. We don't know what the weather is going to be next week, let alone the climate 1 year from now, or 10 years from now, or a century from now. And dare we say, the stakes are extremely high, right? We're putting all of these issues together and doing so in a context in which the stakes are often perceived as being life and death, right? So that's a little glimpse into why water issues are so intractable. The basic structure of water conflict in the United States is something along these lines, right? Too many people, not enough water. That of course, is not very helpful. So maybe a better way to think of it, a slightly better way to think of it as something like this. We've got too many people living in the wrong places. why are you all here? Right? That's one fundamental question that sort of the water scarcity issue in this country presents us with. Here's one of my favorite images, again, that I sometimes show my students. This is a map put together by the state of Colorado. What you're looking at here is the rivers in the state of Colorado. And those blue lines there, the thickness of the blue line depicts the flow of that river. All right, now notice that all the big fat blue lines, impressively the Colorado River itself, right, flow out the western half of the state, down the western slope of the Rocky Mountains. These lines are relatively puny. But where do the people live in Colorado, right? As you all know, the people live all here, right? And we got lots of agricultural activity going on out here. So in order to facilitate all that human development, we've got to bring all those quantities of water over here. And that's no small feat, right? There are massive public works projects, enormous tunnels that you could drive semi-trucks through that are bringing water from, the left side of that map to the right side of the map. That's just the state of Colorado, folks, right? You do the same thing for the United States as a whole, and the picture looks even more absurd, right? We have plenty of water in the nation's artery here, right? The Mississippi and the Missouri River. The eastern half of the country has nice, thick blue lines. I live up here in Notre Dame, Indiana. We're right next to the 5 Great Lakes, which are a substantial fraction of the world's freshwater reserves right there in those lakes, right? So water shortage is not always the name of the game when it comes to water conflicts. There are plenty of places in the world that have abundant freshwater resources. In fact, many of those places, as with Indiana at this very moment, the issue is not too little water, but too much water. I was speaking with some farmers recently near Notre Dame, and their problem right now is we've just had flat out too much rain for the last 2 months. Their crops are not getting enough sunshine to grow. In some instances, they can't even seed, right? So the first little sort of detour I want to take with you here is to an area near where I grew up, where water abundance was the name of the game. I grew up, as I said, in Seattle, and right here near this big, thick line, which is, of course, the Columbia River. Well done, class. The Columbia River, and if you've ever been to Seattle, you know that we're not known for our sunshine and aridity. We're known for our rain. Funny story about my mom. My mom, who emigrated to the United States from post-war Germany, she used to collect rainwater even in Seattle. That's my stock. That's where I come from. But let's go up here and take a look at the Columbia River and see the kinds of conflicts that can arise even in rivers that are enormous and in places where water scarcity is not the principal problem. The Columbia River, as we saw, enormous in terms of its water flow. At many points along its path, it's over a mile wide, just a gigantic river. How many of you have laid eyes physically on the Columbia River at some point in your lives? Okay, good many of you. Terrific. Absolutely gorgeous body of water. Well, with that much water coming off of mountains that steep, it can only mean one thing, right? It's absolutely outstanding for the production of hydropower. This map here shows you the dams on the Columbia River, in the Columbia River Basin. Every red or brown or amber tick mark that you see there is a dam. Now, obviously, some of them are quite small, but some of them are not small at all, right? Some of them rival the dams in Arizona that you're familiar with here, the Hoover Dam and the Lake Mead and Lake Powell and so forth. These dams generate a ton of electricity. The EIA reports that the Columbia River Basin, in the aggregate, is responsible for more than 40% of our total hydroelectric power generation, right? Now, that's great. That has impacted the Pacific Northwest economy in important ways, having carbon-free electricity available at very low base prices anyhow, and it's federally subsidized to boot, right? Who's not going to like that? Many people credit the hydroelectric capacity of the Columbia River Basin with getting us through World War II. It was cheap, abundant hydroelectric power that was thought to provide the impetus for Boeing and the production of numerous airplanes and aircraft in the Pacific Northwest. So this is all great, except if you're one of these guys, right? The Columbia River historically was one of the principal habitats for numerous populations of salmon. Salmon so abundant that they have been designated one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. The salmon runs that used to occupy the Columbia and many of the rivers along the western span of the Pacific Northwest and Canada and on up to Alaska are absolutely unbelievable, breathtaking in their size and in their scope. When Lewis and Clark arrived at the Columbia River for the first time, what they pen in their journals is simply remarkable to read, right? They talk about the river being crowded with salmon, appearing to look like a boiling pot of water, so full of salmon was that water. Many people use this metaphor instead, that the river was so thick with salmon that it was like you could walk from one edge of the river to the other, a full mile across, on the backs of the salmon that you would see. Neither you, nor I, nor our children will ever see that sight, right? In fact, it's quite possible that that sight is lost to humanity forever, and that's something that we need to contend with, right? Some 13 different population groups of salmon on the Columbia are either on the endangered species list or the threatened species list, largely, not solely, but largely as a consequence of the hydroelectric dams that have been placed at every turn on that stream. Now, it's not just salmon, right? It would be one thing if it was just some species. I've heard people say occasionally, well, can't we just sacrifice a species or two? There are other salmon that don't occupy the Columbia River Basin. Maybe that's an okay trade-off to have a thriving economy built on carbon-free energy and so forth. Well, salmon only occupy one slot on that food chain, right? And there are plenty of other animals that depend on them for survival as well. Many of you who follow this story will know that there have been reports in recent months of whale die-offs and so forth, which can be linked directly to the decline in the salmon that are their preferred diet. When they don't have that big source, that big sort of meaty meal and one salmon, they have to go look for much smaller prey, and that prey takes a lot more work, a lot more energy for them to ultimately hunt down. So this is not a problem that we have failed to act on, right? In the entire canon of environmental laws, the Endangered Species Act is often regarded as the pit bull, the strongest of those environmental laws. And it's a law that comes to play, that takes, in fact, a primary role in water conflicts across the West in numerous instances. One of the reasons that the law is regarded as the pit bull of environmental law is because it's not like the many other environmental laws that are laden with discretion. Those other laws say things to federal agencies like, well, do this if it's economically feasible. Do that if it's prudent. Do this, but only if it's within your discretion, if it seems prudent to you. Unlike those laws, the Endangered Species Act speaks in fairly stark terms. And this provision right here is a pretty good and pretty important example of that. It says here, each federal agency shall ensure that any action that it takes is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered species, or, and this phrase is actually more meaningful, or result in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat of such species. Right? That's a pretty robust command. It's not easy to weasel your way out of it. That discovery was made in the late 1970s. The Tellico Dam on the Tennessee River was under construction when this law was passed. Some enterprising law students at the University of Tennessee Law School went into the Tennessee River, found a population of snail darters, these fish that had previously been unknown or really unregarded, and did some scientific studies on those fish, learned that they would be imperiled by the completion of that dam. That case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court at that time, not particularly known for its environmental sensibilities, took a look at the law, took a look at what was going on at the dam, and said, yeah, these kids are right. The dam's got to stop. And ultimately, Congress changed the law a little bit to allow what is called the God Squad, the creation of a cabinet-level group of officials to go ahead and complete projects, even if they imperil the viability of certain species. Anyhow, that example provided an important lesson for future generations of lawmakers and policymakers because it indicated that these words have teeth. and that these words mean something. So, for example, returning back to the Columbia River story here and our friendly salmon, these dams here, especially the dams on the main stem of the Columbia River and the lower portion of the Snake River, are the principal impediments to those populations of migrating salmon that are now at risk of extinction. And often a great deal of attention gets foisted on the federal operators of those dams. Those are all Army Corps of Engineers dams. And so every time a federal agency, some federal entity, has to authorize or relicense the operation of any one of those dams, that's a federal action that is subject to that provision I just showed you a minute ago, right? That federal actor then has to provide in documentary form, right, some evidence that the continued operation of that dam is not going to jeopardize the future existence of that population of fish. That's a tough order when it actually is going to imperil that population of fish. So we've seen numerous battles, in particular around the operation of the Bonneville Dam, the first dam that a migrating salmon returning to its spawning habitat will encounter on its way up the Columbia River. It's actually a gorgeous and impressive structure. If you've never been, I encourage you to make your way to the Columbia River Gorge at some point in your lives. It's a striking place, and this dam is a feat of engineering rivaled only by a few other dams around the country. Absolutely stunning place to be. Also, the site of some very fierce battles over, as you see, right, salmon and steelhead and the many species that are imperiled by that dam's existence. When those federal agencies set out to document that their dam's operation will not imperil the continued existence of that fish, they have a little escape hatch. They can essentially say, well, there are things that we can do to mitigate the harm, all right? Because the last thing these officials want to say is, we've got to remove the dam, right? That's sort of the lesson of that Tennessee River story that I told you a minute ago. But nobody in the Northwest, and certainly not the operators of the dams themselves, want to breach the dam. That is sort of regarded as the nuclear option in the Pacific Northwest. So those agencies come up with all kinds of what are called mitigation measures or reasonable and prudent alternatives. These are legalese for ways that we're going to kind of mitigate the damage, that we're going to save some of the fish, that we're going to make it so that this is not so bad on the fishies as you might think. And each time, those go right on up to Court of Appeals, and the court, in many instances, the same judge, a guy named Judge Redden in Oregon, oversaw these cases for 20 years of his career. He passed away. Now he's got another successor who looks like he's going to do this for 30 odd years as well. But you see headlines like this, right, where these mitigation plans bounce back and forth between the agency operating the dam and the judge. The judge each time looking at it and saying, I don't think this is going to save the fish. There's no evidence this is going to save the fish. The fish species remain imperiled. So let's briefly talk about what are some of these measures. What are some of the things that they do to try to save the fish? Well, the first thing, the basic run-of-the-mill fish ladder. How many of you have ever seen a fish ladder? If you go to the Bonneville Dam they've got a great viewing room, plexiglass wall. You can go down there and you can watch the fish making their way up the fish ladder, some above the water, some beneath the water. It's actually quite impressive. So even in the early 20th century when these dams were being built, this was our first thought. Well, let's make some fish ladders, and some fraction of the fish population will find the fish ladder and make its way up, and this is great. There's only one little problem, right? Fish ladders are a nice sort of confined place to be, like where all the fish are going to go down one path. And some of the animals that like to eat fish have learned that, because they're no dummy, right? They know where their bread is buttered or their fish is cut or whatever it is, whatever metaphor you want. So for the last 15 years or so, there's been a very public confrontation going on between sea lions and the defenders of salmon, right? So the defenders of salmon want to get rid of the sea lions that are just sitting down there or up there, as the case may be, feasting on these salmon. So some of their tactics have gotten quite nasty, right? They've said, well, we're going to use these seal bombs to just scare the dickens out of these sea lions. Sometimes they've flashed bright lights at them. They've blown loud horns at them. And the sea lions just, bat an eye and come right back and feast more. So finally, the salmon defenders said, we've tried everything else. We've got to euthanize the sea lions, all right? Now, that set up a titanic conflict between the sea lion loving community and the salmon loving community, because sea lions are protected too. There's a little thing called the Marine Mammals Protection Act that protects the sea lions as well. And so courts have had to adjudicate these kinds of disputes over whether you can euthanize sea lions to save the salmon. So that's one example of sort of a storied mitigation tactic, but it's not my favorite. My favorite is the honorable trap and haul tactic, all right? So whereas fish ladders are of principal value for large salmon near the end of their life that are working their way back up to spawning ground, what about the young juvenile salmon that need to come out of the spawning ground and work their way down the river, right? In their case, often they're going over the spillway of the dam, or they're going right through the turbines where the power is generated. That's a profoundly disorienting experience, if any of you have tried. I assure you the fish do not come out very happy down the other end. So early on, roughly the last 15, 18 years now, every operating budget for nearly all of those dams has included a line item for trap and haul, essentially a 24/7 operation involving trucks like this that literally go up to the top side of the dam, suck a bunch of water, drive around the dam, and let all the water out, and hope that there's some juvenile fish in there along the way. And that is, folks, state-of-the-art fish mitigation, salmon protection tactic, right, in the Columbia River Basin. Now, here's the great irony here. Let's go back to this map here for a second. Why do these dams even exist? Obviously, part of it is hydropower, but in particular, these dams right here, a big reason that they even exist is because Lewiston, Idaho, which is located right about here, really wanted a port. Lewiston is, at this moment, the furthest inland port in the United States, and they're very proud of that fact. And so Lewiston, it was really important to them to have a deep water port where they could have barge traffic go from Lewiston and reach the Pacific and points distant from there, right? And so these, so we've got essentially a major major shipping traffic going on the Columbia River. So now just think what this means. We've got all kinds of cargo, commercial goods, cars, grain, whatever, going up and down boats on the Columbia River, while the fish are on the highway next door, right? Stop and think about that for a moment. Maybe you'll figure it out on your way home, right? I mean, it just absolutely defies all logic. Okay, much more that we could say about the Columbia River Basin. I'm not even going to have time to talk to you about sort of the Grand Coulee Dam, the largest concrete structure in the United States, or the Hanford nuclear site in eastern Washington. These are major issues for the vitality of the Columbia River, but I'll spare you the account so we can move on to other points here. Okay, I said a moment ago that the basic structure of water conflict is something like this: too many people, not enough water. But once we leave the relatively wet Northwest and move on down to the semi-arid and arid parts of the American West, the dynamic changes a little bit. And in those parts of the country, another crucial dynamic is this. Water, quite simply, is property. And property is something that people love and hold on to dearly. And we love it so dearly that our Constitution protects it. And many of you will know that the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution essentially says government can't take your property without paying for it, right? This is hopefully old news to you. What might be new news to you, however, is to know that simply regulating property can, in some instances, diminish the value of that property so significantly that it can constitute a taking of property. And this is something that the lawyers among you will know well, and that lawyers spend a good deal of time fighting about, right, is when government regulation kind of rises to the level of diminishing the value of your property so substantially that it now constitutes a taking. And the net effect of this principle is that it makes it really difficult for governments to say to owners of water, hey, leave that water in the stream for the good of the fishies or the dams or the recreators or the boat traffic or whatever it is. It's very hard for lawmakers to say to owners of a private good, you can't take that good out of the stream. Or you've got to leave it there for the benefit of the public. So I'm going to move now into some different waterways, some different basins, and you'll see a little bit more about this kind of dynamic at work. Why am I showing you a picture of the Bundy standoff? Well, I guess simply to make the point that many people, right, would be quite comfortable with government regulating their property in some fashion. People's tolerance for sort of government regulation on behalf of the public good varies enormously. Out west, though, there's a significant strand of affection for property rights, right? And the Bundy standoff is only the most extreme example, right? It taps into a sort of self-reliant spirit that Westerners have and that they rightfully cherish in many respects, right? And so in many instances of political conflict surrounding water rights, it doesn't take much government regulation for people's opposition to that regulation to kind of kick in, especially when property rights are at stake. So maybe to point out some of these examples, let's go back and talk about some stories in the Snake River Basin. Absolutely gorgeous basin. If you haven't been to the Snake, this is kind of what you're missing. The Snake, the Klamath River Basin, and the San Joaquin River Basin. These are areas where the conflict around water tends to look a little bit different than it did around the Columbia. Some elements are still there. You still got kind of problems with aging dams and endangered species. But what you have and what you add to the mix in these places is rich an important network of federal irrigation contracts, federal dams that are now being run by the Bureau of Reclamation, not the Army Corps. The Bureau of Reclamation built those dams specifically to irrigate arid parts of the country, and did so based on revenue that was going to be coming to them from purchasers, farmers who were purchasing those water rights, right? Under these contracts. Many of these places all have tribal water claims. We'll talk about that in a moment, and also groundwater resources nearby. That's important because as constraints on river water, on surface waters manifest, increasingly users tap into aquifers beneath their feet. No conversation about water in the West would be complete without conversation about groundwater. So let's take a quick look at a tour around some of the issues that arise in these domains. The Snake River, in part, I've already told you some of the important parts of this story, because the Snake is, of course, tributary to the Columbia, and many of the same concerns that animate the disputes over the Columbia animate the disputes over the Snake River Basin as well. So, for example, the recent demise of whales and such has just led to stronger calls to tear down those dams at the lower portion of the Snake that I was showing you before. But in addition to those kind of conflicts, which tend to have their grip up in this portion of the Snake River, down here in the lower portion of the Snake, we've had a great deal more conflict over groundwater rights. Idaho actually ranks third in the country in terms of states withdrawing water from aquifers, using groundwater. That order, anyone want to guess what state is number one on that list? What state consumes more groundwater than any other? California, good. Number two, may surprise you, Arkansas, actually. Arkansas's number two, and then Idaho's number three. And the reason for that is that because by the time you get up into into the Snake River Basin up here proper in southern Idaho, we're now in quite arid territory, and most of that river has long been spoken for. By the time you get to that the higher reaches of the Snake, most of that water has got to be left in the river, either to satisfy senior users of the water downstream or to satisfy federal environmental requirements generally imposed by, you guessed it, the Endangered Species Act. So in that area of the state, farmers have had to make much more regular use of groundwater. Fortunately for them, there's a very productive aquifer over here in the eastern Snake River Basin. The only problem is that drawing down that aquifer they've been essentially doing it in an unsustainable fashion, right? They've been drawing down more water than exists, and that's a problem that we'll see time and time again across the West. Elements of this story play themselves out also in the Klamath River Basin. I hope that what you're starting to see, by the way, as you hear some of these conflicts play out, is that many of these conflicts over Western rivers become kind of mega conflicts. I mean, each of these rivers, you could write volumes about the dynamics in these conflicts. The Klamath River, the war has been going on here, and when war is only slightly too aggressive a term, because the fighting over the resources of the Klamath River have been going on for decades and have become extraordinarily fierce. probably the apex of this fight took place in the early 2000s when, after a great deal of conflict, the federal government agreed to essentially satisfy its obligations under those irrigation contracts that I was mentioning earlier and take a bunch of water out of the stream in order to provide it to the farmers. In so doing, they left so little water in the stream that the stream temperature increased dangerously, and there was a massive fish die-off. Estimates of between 30 to 60,000 salmon just sort of rotting there at the bottom of the stream. And this was a visceral sort of call to arms for many in the Klamath River Basin. It produced a decade's worth of negotiations that culminated quite recently in a massive plan to actually tear down some of the dams that were most responsible for imperiling salmon species, and that frankly didn't bring that much hydroelectricity to the table anyhow. So this was part of kind of a grand bargain that was struck after years and years and years of tough negotiations involving tribes and both states and numerous municipal levels of government and so forth, and private commercial actors like energy companies and such, only to just last month, or in the past month, learn that the Trump administration is withdrawing support for that plan, and we literally are going all the way back to the drawing board. There's nothing more I can say to you about that because I have no idea what will happen next. Right? We're literally back to the drawing board. This is another thing we see in some of these just megalithic conflicts across the West, is you'll see enormous efforts be placed into some grand bargain, only to watch that grand bargain kind of fall apart. That's a perfect segue into the story of the San Joaquin River Basin. Those of you that spend any time in the Bay Area know that concern over the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta has just been boiling over also for eons. There are several precipitants here, but again, the biggest one is the presence in that delta of certain species of smelt that are endangered, again, you guessed it, and the Endangered Species Act has essentially required the federal actors that manage portions of that river to leave more water in the stream in order to preserve the smelt. This at a time when Southern California's demand for water has been increasing and increasing and increasing, where Southern California has been putting more and more money on the table, essentially, to try to build massive tunnels to divert water from the Sacramento River into the California Water Project that would essentially bring that water down to the southern portion of the state. This, too, produced a plan that Governor Brown had championed and that Governor Newsom has now pulled the plug on as well. So, again, another situation where a massive negotiation had been going on for a long time. We thought we maybe had a deal, and now we don't have a deal, and now I don't think anyone really knows what's going to happen next. You'll notice that both those last two headlines, this one and the one in the Klamath, were in this month, right? May of 2019. Makes it hard to write a talk like this and have it any staying power, right? All right. So now the San Joaquin is a great segue to talking about groundwater. I don't know what your mental conception of groundwater is. If you don't have a background in hydrology, I sure don't. It's hard to imagine what's going on with water beneath your feet. I know for me, my mental image is the image of going to the beach and digging in the sand and watching that hole fill up with water if I'm really close to the water's edge, right? So I kind of think, okay, there's water down there, and it's sort of moving through the spaces between the sand. That seems intuitive. Well, in Notre Dame, I live literally across my backyard from a hydrologist, and he's helped me understand groundwater a little bit better. And one of the main things to learn about groundwater use is that when you are sucking water out of the ground, you create a cone of depression. The reason for that is that water migrates through ground slowly. It's not like, a drink where if I, suck out of my drink, the water uniformly drops in my cup, right? When water is moving through some kind of substance, the water can't flow back to some equilibrium state very quickly. And the pace, the speed with which it will do so is determined by whatever, the nature of this material. That material may be such that allows that water to regain its equilibrium in a week, a month, a decade, a millennium, or several millennia, right? I mean, literally, that's the kind of range of orders of magnitudes of difference that we're talking about when you compare different kinds of media through which groundwater can travel. That kind of variation has important implications for any policy affecting groundwater withdrawal. Because, of course, the pace at which, the speed with which that water is going to move or migrate underground is exactly the pace at which that groundwater aquifer can be replenished, right? It also is going to dictate the pace at which any pollutants or contaminants in that stream are going to be sucked by that straw over into those groundwater reserves. All those issues are affected by the pace of movement in that aquifer driven by that cone of depression instituted by a well. Only as the 19th century gave way to the 20th century to the 21st, did hydrologists really start to gain a much better, more developed sense of how water moves underground. Court decisions involving groundwater conflicts in the early part of the 20th century referred to movements of water underneath the ground as occult secrets known only to sorcerers and such, right? That we had really no way of understanding what was going on underneath the ground. Now we're finally getting to the point where we can understand this a little bit better. Some aspects of the harms caused by overdrawing down your groundwater supplies are actually quite obvious because they're felt at the surface. This is a famous image. You may have actually seen it before. What you're looking at here is a telephone pole in the Central Valley of California, so near that San Joaquin Basin that I showed you a moment ago, indicating where ground level was in 1925 and 1955. That's what we call subsidence, where you've sucked out so much water from beneath the ground that literally the entire ground is sinking that far. Now, when I first saw that, that was just staggering to me, right? My hydrologist neighbor put this in some context. The amount of water sucked out of the aquifer in the central portion of the state of California is equivalent to Lake Erie being drawn out of the central part of California every 3 years or so. I mean, an absolutely staggering volume of water coming out of these aquifers. And when you think about it that way, maybe it makes a little bit more sense that that's the kind of subsidence that we're seeing. Here's some more recent images showing similar phenomena, right? The land essentially giving way. Here's a chart just over a 7-month period here showing recession of land subsidence of 2 to 13 inches. So remarkable phenomena that we see, and only the most obvious of the consequences associated with drawing down groundwater too heavily. Las Vegas is thinking about these kinds of issues mightily right now, as well they ought. Las Vegas, for reasons that we'll discuss in a moment, is struggling with its own water supply issues. And so the current plan that the Southern Nevada Water Authority has put in place involves a massive pipeline running up the eastern half of the state to some aquifers up here. So this is the Idaho border. Excuse me, somewhere up here, not too far out of view, is the Idaho border. Here's Utah, as you can see. The Great Basin National Park is around here somewhere. You guys can probably spot it more readily than I can. And the plan is essentially to build a network of groundwater wells, high volume pumping wells up there in the eastern portion of the state, build a big pipeline, and channel that water 300 miles down to sate the thirst of Vegas. This plan is still working its way through the courts as we speak. And it could be another one of those situations where people have these great massive plans only to get thwarted at the final stage. So we'll see what happens. But this one is remarkable for its ambition, dare I say foolhardiness when it comes to groundwater. Folks at the Great Basin National Park are dearly concerned that the overconsumption of groundwater there is going to essentially produce such a massive dust bowl, essentially, in the national park, that it will do away with the famous night skies that are so well known at the Great Basin National Park, that it will imperil the bat communities that live in the caves at that park. How many of you have been to Great Basin National Park? Has anyone actually seen the bats there. I'm not sure if you can go into the caves and see them, but anyhow, so there are grievous concerns about the decimation of groundwater supplies in that part of the state. Now, moving here into the final, into the home stretch of this talk, and moving closer to home, why is Vegas in the peril that it is? Well, you probably are you taught in school in Arizona about the Colorado River Compact? Is that something you kind of learn in, like, do your parents sit you down and put you on their lap and like you talk about not really? Okay. Well, the Colorado River Compact is, of course, a crucial bedrock of the law of the Colorado River, the river that is easily the most important one for your purposes here. And when the Colorado River Compact was forged in the 1920s, Las Vegas didn't really exist. It was just kind of a two-bit little cowboy town. And so the allocation of water given to Nevada was really, really puny. And so Nevada has been sort of fighting its way back ever since. And of course, the conflicts between the states of the lower basin and the upper basin are famous and well known. We can say a little bit more about that. Las Vegas is entitled to some small portion of water from Lake Mead, but as you no doubt have been hearing in the local news, Lake Mead's levels are reaching the point at which sort of dangerous measures will be taken. This is a dated chart now. I just read early on the way over here today that the dam operators expect that we're okay. You know, the crucial level is 1,075 feet. That's the number you keep hearing people talk about. And they think that we're probably okay for 2019. However, they said that there's a greater than 50% chance in their assessment that in 2020 we'll hit that number based on their current 2-year forecast of precipitation levels and water consumption levels during that time frame. So that's, of course, why Vegas is concerned. Here's another chart that shows you much the same thing. In both these charts, you'll notice that there's been a substantial drop-off from the year 2000 to the year 2017, right? That's because, as you, again, undoubtedly know, this region has seen essentially a mega drought, a drought longer than any other drought that has been felt in this region since we started keeping official records. Easily the longest drought in the century-long history or so. So it's more dramatic even here on this picture. This blue line shows you the total reservoir capacity of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. When you put them together, you can see that in the early 2000s, we suffered quite a hit to the capacity, to the water that was being stored in those dams. And one point that is often lost here is the following. When we look at a chart like that and you hear about an 18-year-long drought, the first thing that comes to mind for many people is climate change. And it may very well be that this drought is the consequence of anthropogenic climate change. It's very tough to know, though. We often, as human beings, live through our seasonal cycles and assume that the climate is something that more or less repeats itself every year in roughly the same way. But there's all kinds of evidence in the scientific record that that's simply not the case. That there have been periodic climate changes in localized areas across the American West that way long before we were burning coal and fossil fuels had cycles that were much longer than just a single year. My alma mater at Stanford, there was there was an article in the Stanford Alumni magazine that I picked off my coffee table recently that was telling about how some researchers from Stanford had been conducting some research up in the Sierra Nevada mountains, had found a mountain lake and were diving down to the bottom of this lake where they found erect pine trees, 100 feet underwater. And so they cut off some of these trees and did some tree ring analysis on these trees. They dated back to roughly 1300, the 13th, 14th century. Now think about that for a second, right? These were fully mature pine trees submerged in this lake. That means that at a period of time when there was no coal being burned, right, there was a period of time in the Sierra Nevada that was so dry that what is now a 100-foot deep mountain lake did not exist, right? So that kind of natural variability happens. And often we humans forget that to our peril. The Colorado River Basin Compact itself was produced on the basis of data from the early 20th century. They took numbers gauge readings of the volume of water passing through the Colorado River from roughly 1898 to roughly 1918. They thought they had 20 years of data. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turned out that that 20 years of data was roughly the wettest 20 years that we've seen before or since in the Colorado River. They assumed that the volume of water coming through the Colorado River was going to be something close to 17 million acre feet each year. In the last 15 years or so, that number has been closer to 12.5, 13 million acre feet. And a long-term running average is probably something closer to 14.5 million. So when you hear people in the upper basin feeling like they kind of got screwed by the Colorado River Basin Compact, it's because they structured that compact on the basis of an understanding that was very quickly proven to be a bad one. Right? They essentially committed to a delivery of, they took the number 15 because it was a nice easy number. Said we're going to give anything over 15 to Mexico. Mexico gets its 2.5 or whatever it is, 1.5, I guess, 1.5 to Mexico. That 15 will just cut it in half. 7.5 million acre feet for the upper basin, 7.5 million acre feet for the lower basin. And rather than just simply saying we don't know what that number is going to be, whatever that number is, we'll cut it in half. They promised to deliver at Lee's Ferry 7.5 million acre feet of water. That means that on low years, where there's lower than 15 million acre feet of water in the river, right? Who gets screwed? Who is responsible for making that shortfall? Well, first of all, it's Mexico. Let's be clear about that, right? Because that's the first delivery not to be made. But it's the upper basin, right? The upper basin states are the ones that have to essentially eat that diminution. Let's see, how are we doing for time here? There's much more. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So maybe I'll just, in 60 seconds, say something about tribal water claims, and then we can open it up for questions. But I think one of the things that concerns me most when I look at what you have going on down here in the Colorado River is the fact that so many of your tribal water claims are not yet adjudicated. Here's what I mean by that. There's a federal legal doctrine called the Federal Reserved Water Rights Doctrine that essentially says that reservations of federal land are entitled to a quantity of water sufficient to satisfy or fulfill the purposes of that federal land reservation. And that those reservations come with a priority date for purposes of state water law equivalent to the year that the reservation was made. So in a state like Arizona, where every water claim has a particular priority date attached to it, these are very, very old, very senior water rights. In the Colorado River Basin, there are something like 22 different tribes that have had their water rights claims fully adjudicated or settled. And so those claims have been quantified. But 13 tribes have not yet gone through that process. And that's going to be a lengthy and litigious process when it happens. Of those 22 tribes that have resolved their claims and have quantified them, only about half of the water that they're entitled to has been used thus far. So in the years to come, those tribes are perfectly within their rights to augment their water use in important ways. And then you've still got these 13 tribes that have not yet thoroughly adjudicated their claims. So those are the kinds of concerns that would keep me up at night if I lived here. But I live near the Great Lakes, so enjoy your time, folks. It's been it's been great to be with you. I hope that at the end of the day, you can all remember that it's these kinds of things that we want to preserve for our posterity, for our children, for future generations, because there is an extraordinarily human value that comes not only to the kind of more mundane, banal uses of water that we do every day when we take showers and drink and so forth, but it's vistas like these and the magic that they evoke that make these kinds of issues so important. It's been a treat to be with you, and I now would love to hear your thoughts and questions on this matter. Oh, thank you.
Questions, comments?
I see one over here.
You said that the Fifth Amendment applies to water as property.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that it also applies to the quality of the water too. You can't mess it up and deliver it downstream. Is that true?
That's a great question, and it's actually being litigated right now. It's not so easy. So the first appellate decision on this question came out of the Everglades. There, if you know the Florida hydrology at all, basically water in southern Florida, fresh water kind of moves through the Everglades very, very slowly on out into the Gulf of Mexico. In order to keep cities free from that water, they've basically built these big systems of levees, and all the irrigation that goes on in South Florida has basically severely compromised the water quality on certain sides of that levee. So one of the issues essentially for farmers and municipal water users in South Florida has been, is it illegal for federal water operators essentially to mix in the bad irrigation outflow, or post-irrigation water with the relatively fresh northern flows of water. The first legal decision on the matter said there is no right to water of a certain quality, and said that at best you've got essentially what amounts to a tort claim against a party that unduly dirties your water, but that you don't have a property right to water of a certain quality. Almost certainly that decision will not be the final word on the matter. So we will have, I'm sure, numerous other instances where that very question is litigated.
That decision is overturned, or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
Has anybody thought about applying that same property right to air?
So yes and no. So there are very smart people who are trying to use property doctrines to protect clean air. The effort that has advanced the farthest is not based, however, on private property rights, but rather public communal rights under something called the public trust doctrine. You've probably heard something of the kids' climate change lawsuit going on in Oregon right now. Maybe some of you have heard about this in the news. And that's essentially the theory on which that case is moving forward. I'd say it's a stretch. It's something that the courts are not likely to be receptive to, and that they face enormous headwinds in terms of the structure of current law. But this is exactly the kind of line of thinking that that the proponents of that litigation would like to see advanced. Yeah, great question.
Just following up on that, the groups in Des Moines, Iowa have sued the farmers north of them because of runoff that they then have to spend money cleaning.
Yeah.
And that's just hit the courts now. And even though it's been in the works for a number of years.
Yeah.
It's another case where they're going to kind of look to see, is that a reasonable claim to make?
Yeah, yeah. That's, even right here in your part of the world, that issue manifests with respect to salinity, right? Mexico has long had a fairly reasonable grievance against the United States for passing off highly salinated water. I believe the current solution essentially involves channeling post-irrigation runoff into a separate estuary, essentially not the Colorado River estuary, but another one, the La Cienega estuary, which is, pardon me? Yeah, Santa Clara de Cienega, is that what it's called? Okay, all right. You say that far better than I do. At any rate, so that's where the over-salinated water essentially goes, and they do that roughly in order to keep the actual formal delivery in the main stem of the Colorado above the negotiated limits.
And then on the two water tunnels, so
Oh yeah.
Governor Newsom did that in an attempt. So he'd been trying to get it to a one water tunnel, and
Right.
there was pushback. So he decided he would go and cancel the whole thing in the attempt to get everybody back to the table to finalize the one water tunnel.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so yeah. Maybe I portrayed it too apocalyptically, right? There has been this protracted dispute about is a one tunnel solution or a two tunnel solution the better way to go. A query, right? Side bet. What year are we actually going to see the completion of those tunnels? I suspect only slightly before we see a nuclear waste repository go in at Yucca Mountain. But anyhow, other thoughts, questions, comments?
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
What do you think, or what do you feel about giving personhood to rivers and other natural?
Yeah, so are you all aware of this? This is a phenomenon, if you sort of look at the movement of law globally, there has been an increasing effort globally to essentially assign personhood to portions of the natural world, with the idea that by doing so, you would give them a measure of legal rights or legal standing that would entitle human advocates or representatives to make claims before the court and invoke different kinds of doctrines than they can now. This is not a set of doctrines that go very well with the U.S. legal system as it's currently constituted. But it has made some traction in New Zealand, in Bolivia, in certain portions of South America. There was an effort made in U.S. law already in the early 1970s, right about the time that many of the marquee environmental laws were being passed in this country, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, things like that. There was a famous law review article written by a Stanford law professor called Do Trees Have Standing? And the idea already back then was that perhaps there would be a way that we could essentially marshal the enormous overlay of human rights doctrine and somehow assign it over to trees, or as is now more commonly thought, rivers, and in so doing, get the benefit of these doctrines that would treat them, though they, with more dignitarian concerns in sight. There have been a couple municipal attempts in the United States to adopt this kind of approach. There was a town in in Pennsylvania, that recently tried to use this language, and the first lawsuit that kind of peripherally dealt with this issue upheld that provision. So that kind of got people very excited. But I can't imagine anything like this sort of forming a bedrock in American environmental law for decades to come. That kind of change would have to be slow, to involve all kinds of other ancillary changes in the American sort of legal firmament.
Great talk, thank you. First of all, your discussion about the Lower Snake River dams gave me PTSD. I wrote my dissertation on that topic the year 2000.
Oh my, yeah.
When the policy process initiated to start about the removal of those lower dams. As you know, we recently completed the Colorado River Basin drought contingency plans, which were negotiated among the 7 western states that share in the allocation of the river, and then signed, passed through Congress rapidly, and signed by the Trump administration, endorsed. Do you see this as a sign of potential collaboration in some of these large basin governance processes, or
so
is it unique?
If you phrase the question that way, then absolutely yes. I am absolutely encouraged by I mean, where else do you see people agreeing on things across party lines in this country right now? Nowhere. I mean, right? And so the fact that a major, extraordinarily complicated issue actually produced an agreement of some kind that nearly every stakeholder was on board with, I mean, it's nothing short of miraculous. And I think we should absolutely celebrate that. One of your own colleagues here, Rhett Larson at the law school, I hope I'm not outing him by saying this, but he, in an effort to make a deliberately provocative statement, just to sort of get a conversation going, I recently heard him say that 50 years from now, from the standpoint of water, it will be better to live here than in the Eastern Seaboard. And that's because you all take your water issues so dang seriously, as you have to, right? And people have to put their brains together and iron out their differences and work out conflicts and compromises that are substantial, where everyone, gives up something and hammers out an agreement that can actually gain a consensus. And so I absolutely celebrate it. What I thought you were going to ask was, will it stand up in court? And that I don't know. The Imperial Irrigation District is the principal opponent of this arrangement, and man, I'll tell you what. If there's any entity in the West that knows how to lawyer up, it's the Imperial Irrigation District. And they are a formidable teams of lawyers, and they have given fits to everybody that has opposed them over the years. They haven't won every case by far, not by a long shot, but they always put up a heck of a fight. And I really do think that for many of the irrigators in the Salton Sea down there, it's sort of becoming an existential battle for them. They're so close to having nothing left but a saline basin of water that throwing another $500,000 worth of legal fees.
$300 million will fix that, though.
Yeah, well,
That's all they want $300 million.
yeah, and so if maybe that's just a bargaining chip, right? And if somebody can buy them off, then then great. But if they choose to sort of make a doctrinal, sort of plant a flag in the ground and have some court observe it rather than take the payout, that's where I would get worried. So, anyhow, great question. Yes.
On that, I can do it without a mic. To be provocative on that note, not deliberately so, but we're here to have fun, right?
Right.
There's a number of people that have said that the whole DCP is just, even the people who struck the deal said, it's an interim measure on the way to something else.
Sure. Yeah.
And even the 1980 Groundwater Management Act here was really an interim measure.
Yeah.
In the minds
Yeah.
of those same people.
Yeah.
So, what we look at these great, achievements,
Yes.
political achievements.
Yeah.
But maybe they're only really incremental things.
Yeah.
And in another 20 years, we're pumping sand in Pinellas County.
Yes.
So, just your thoughts.
No, I mean, that's true. In very important respect, everything you do is interim, right? I mean, like, it's just one interim step after that. Everything is kind of just a band-aided together solution. And I guess the real question is, will there ever be that kind of focusing event that compels a true sort of watershed moment where we really have to come at this issue completely differently? Something, again, just to adopt the sort of nuclear example, the sort of a 3 Mile Island type moment where there's some event that sort of focuses everybody's attention on how close we are to sort of some imperiling event. I mean, think about what happened in Johannesburg, right? Last year. Was it last year that was going on with their water supply? Cape Town, excuse me. Thank you. Yeah. Would that get the job? Would that sort of sharpen the mind a little bit more and make more concessions be forthcoming? I don't know. Even that one's whatever freedom I have being from Notre Dame and getting into law of my grades in here. Even that one, I'm not sure of. Maybe last one or last two. I don't know. How are we for time?
Yeah.
Do we have time for like 2 questions for me?
I think so.
Okay. First question is like about the map, the one that you showed about the levels of water.
Yeah.
In the 2 lakes. It looked like is there a correlation of like water levels to political leaders or who runs the country?
Oh, you mean Lake Powell?
Yeah.
No, those are solely a feature of or a function of precipitation levels.
Because it looks like there's like certain leaders.
Yeah, that's purely as you'll learn, correlation is not causation, right? So it may be a sort of a provocative little link there, but yeah, there's no.
Like stocks, for example, as soon as
Right.
goes in,
Yeah.
water levels go down. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
a correlation.
yeah.
Second one was about what's the best strategy for like solutions. Should solutions to water issues use like the old system and the laws and the technology, or should we establish a whole new system, new laws, and new technology?
So here the crucial impediment is this fact that water is property. Because water is property, the possibility of sort of a wholesale regime change is nearly nil. There have been very, very few times in American history where we have successfully taken an entire regime structure on property and just eradicated it or changed it. The most obvious one being slavery, right? Slaves were regarded as property, and then the Emancipation Proclamation, we fought a war to basically say that's not so, and we don't have to pay you for it, by the way, right? We're not going to pay you for your freed slave. But since then, every major attempt to sort of change property rights in some wholesale way has met with a court decision saying, if you're going to change it that way, you've got to pay for it. So, we could essentially say, all right, we don't want landowners to own the groundwater beneath their feet, as is currently the case. But no one is under any illusions about that, right? Were we to make that kind of a wholesale change, the taxpayer would essentially have to pony up the billions of dollars it would be to essentially buy out those water claims and bring them under state control. So I think that ship has more or less sailed, you know.
Well,
Well, it seems like you asked about what the event's gonna be that kind of triggers,
Yeah.
you know, the kind of a more of awareness. I think Johnson Ranch could be the event. It's out by Queen Creek, between Florence and Queen Creek. They will run out of water pretty soon, you know, and because of groundwater. And people, a lot of retirees,
Yeah.
a lot of families just have homes out there.
Yeah.
So when you get enough critical mass of homes just becoming basically without water,
Yeah.
and hence without sewer too, I think that could be a trigger. Now that could happen as soon as, 10 years.
Yeah.
I don't think anything else, that these interims, nobody has paid a penalty here for, they did the deal, nobody uses water differently. I mean, everybody just keeps rolling along.
Yeah.
Nobody gets denied a pool permit, nobody gets denied landscaping permits, no houses get denied.
Yeah.
I mean, they're fighting a little bit in Peoria and stuff. So it's so incremental, but I think there could be some, just like the days when the people were buying lots without seeing them.
Yeah. Right.
Enough
Oh,
of
right.
them-
Yeah.
Enough of them got penalized, the state actually took some initiative and started, stopping that.
Yeah.
I think the same thing might be if real people start to lose their houses.
Yeah.
And they totally become valueless.
Yeah.
Because they don't have that resource.
Yeah.
I think that's.
No, I think you could well be right. I mean, that's the kind of thing, right, that where it sort of hits the typical, the sort of typical homeowner. I mean, perhaps that would be the kind of scenario where some greater awareness would be awakened. There was similar talk in the Front Range of Colorado that all these endless streams of subdivisions being built on paper water rights that were, had not sort of been proven up. People speak about the issue the same way over there, and it could well be. Hadn't seemed to happen yet, but perhaps it could.
Thank you, everybody. Go Irish.